Welcome to our webinar. My name is Gigi Norcross, Vice President of Business Development for the Green Century Funds, and I will be your moderator today. Very excited to take us through this session, as our goals are to give you some more information about shareholder advocacy as a strategy for generating impact around environmental issues. And we have a terrific panel lined up today to talk about a specific example, and that is protection of the Okefenokee Wildlife Refuge in Georgia. A couple of housekeeping matters. If you could make sure that you're on mute, that would be great. You also can pose questions throughout the webinar, and we ask that you use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to pose those questions. If we see them over the course of the webinar and are able to answer them as part of the speaker's presentations, we'll do that. Otherwise, we will leave time at the end of the session for plenty of questions. So then, without further ado, I will turn things over to our first speaker, and that is Josh Marks. Josh will be followed by Annie Sanders from Green Century, who will be followed by Sister Jean Slowinski, so that you know the lineup that's coming, but Josh will get us started. Josh is managing partner for Green Marks Consulting and also president for Georgians for the Okefenokee. So he will bring his expertise and experience with respect to this as an issue area. And that is how we will get things started. So Josh, off to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Gigi. And thank you everybody for joining. Really excited to be here to talk to you about one of my most famous, which is the Okefenokee Swamp. And I want to thank Green Century for the opportunity and my fellow panelist, Sister Jean Slowinski, as well. So what I'm going to do is take you on a virtual tour through the Okefenokee Swamp and tell you about this latest mining threat that has generated all the controversy to kind of lay the groundwork for our discussion today. So let me see if I can go ahead and share my screen and get started with the show. Gigi, are you seeing the show now? Okay, great. Okay, so welcome everybody to the Okefenokee, what I again like to call the most magical swamp on Earth. And let me just make sure that I am, okay, there we go. Just to, again, introduce myself, I'm the managing partner of Green Mark Consulting, which is a law firm and consulting firm based here in Atlanta. I focus on environmental, real estate, sustainability, and renewable energy law. I'm also the president of Georgians for the Okefenokee, which is a statewide nonprofit organization that is focused on protecting the Okefenokee from threat posed by mining. And I've been in the conservation environmental law world for over 30 years. So here the Okefenokee is a great aerial view showing the Okefenokee, which at over 438,000 acres is the largest black water swamp in North America. And we say black water because the enormous amounts of organic material that degrade create a tannic acid, which gives the water its dark brown or black color. And that's why we call it black water. It's a very unique type of ecosystem. It is located in the southeast corner of Georgia on the Florida border. It is protected by the largest national wildlife refuge east of the Mississippi at 407,000 acres, which was created by FDR in 1937. And of that acreage, about 354,000 acres are protected in federal wilderness, which is the largest, which makes it the third largest wilderness area east of the Mississippi. And wilderness is the highest level of protection of any federal land. That means that you cannot have any motorized traffic. There's no hunting allowed. There's no mining. There's no development. It's the most primitive, pristine type of landscape that you can encounter. Um, Unlike the Everglades, which is probably its biggest brother in the swamp world in the eastern US, the Okefenokee hasn't been compromised by development or agricultural use for over 100 years, which makes it incredibly unique and valuable. Um, it is a magnet of biodiversity. It hosts over 1,000 species of plants and animals, number of which are endangered. It serves as the headwaters of the famous Suwannee River, which drains to the southwest. It goes through southwest Georgia, on through the panhandle of Florida, and into the Gulf of Mexico. And it also serves as the headwaters of the St. Mary's River, which serves as the boundary between Georgia and Florida in the southeastern part of Georgia, and it exits into the Atlantic Ocean. Because it is relatively far away from municipal areas and cities, the light pollution is very low, and that makes the stargazing opportunities exceptional. And because of that, it has been recognized as an international dark sky park, attracting stargazers from all over the world. In addition to its conservation magnificence, it's also an enormous carbon sink. It's one of the largest natural carbon sinks in the eastern US. Recent studies show that it sequesters over 514 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in its peat beds, which are up to 15 feet thick, and the peat beds are leaves, bark, soil that have fallen off of trees over hundreds and thousands of years, and it's the precursor of coal. And as long as that heat and the carbon that's locked in there is kept underwater, that carbon is safe. So keep that in mind. That's going to be an important point we'll come back to. Um, but in addition to its conservation and climate aspects, it's also a cultural touchstone to two very important communities. One is the Native American community. The Muskogee Creek Nation used to call the Okefenokee its home. They lived there for thousands of years until they were forcibly uprooted and marched to Oklahoma in the 1830s during the Trail of Tears. But to this day, it remains a cultural touchstone for that nation. And it's also a literal refuge for the African American community. During Jim Crow times, from the 1930s through the 1960s, the Okefenokee was the only place that the African American community could go for outdoor recreation, for fresh air, because the beaches of Georgia were whites only. They were off limits to that community. And we've had a number of people who were alive back then, saying that if not for the Okefenokee, they didn't know what their lives would have been like. In addition to its conservation, climate, and cultural status, the Okefenokee is also a commercial hub of Southeast Georgia. Over 800,000 visitors per year, creates over 700 jobs, and it generates over $90 million into the local economy. So the Okefenokee is an economic linchpin for the southeastern part of the state. So what we like to call the Okefenokee is it's a quadruple threat of the four C's: conservation, climate, culture, and commerce, making it almost a unicorn in the eastern US. And it's because of this unicorn status that UNESCO, which is the United Nations agency that collects the foremost wild places in the world on its World Heritage Site list, has indicated that the Okefenokee Wildlife Refuge would be a welcome addition to that list. In September of last year, the US Department of Interior formally launched the process to get it added, and it would be the first US National Wildlife Refuge to achieve that designation. So the mining story starts with something called Trail Ridge. Now on your screen, hopefully you can see this orange figure that runs north and south, immediately adjacent to the refuge. That's called Trail Ridge. Trail Ridge is an ancient sand dune that was created by the wave action of the Atlantic Ocean when the Atlantic Ocean, which is currently over here, was over here, hundreds of thousands of years ago when global temperatures were higher and the sea level was much higher. When the global temperatures cooled and the ocean waters receded, Trail Ridge acted as a natural dam that held the water back on the western side and helped create the swamp. And to this day, it holds the groundwater in the surface water in the swamp. And it also directs rainwater that falls on the ridge into the swamp because it's 50 feet higher at its highest elevation than the level of the swamp. So Trail Ridge you can also imagine the edge of a clawfoot bathtub that's filled with water. Trail Ridge is one edge of the bathtub. And without that edge of the bathtub, all the water would spill out. The problem for the Okefenokee is that Trail Ridge also contains titanium-bearing minerals for pigments that are used to whiten paint, paper, plastic, and most notoriously food products, such as the white filling in Oreo cookies and the Amazon M&Ms, which is heartbreaking for me because I love both of those junk foods. But it is really showing how crazy it is that our junk food obsession might put this great swamp at great risk. So hold that thought. So the history of mining starts with a company that y'all recognize called DuPont. Um, DuPont is one of the largest and oldest chemical companies in the world, and it started mining for titanium bearing minerals at the southern end of Trail Ridge in the 1950s. And from the 1950s through the 1990s, it mined. And then in the early 1990s, the titanium at the southern end of the Trail Ridge in Northeast Florida was running out, and they were looking to find a new resource of titanium. And they decided, well, we're going to get all this titanium that's locked in Trail Ridge right next to the Okefenokee. And so in 1995, they purchased 16,000 acres on the northeast side of the swamp, and they leased 23,000 acres on the southeast side of the swamp. And so they controlled 39,000 acres for a titanium strip mine. Needless to say, the world went crazy in response. I was with the Sierra Club at the time, and I was a leader of the Sierra Club's effort to fight the mining project. But in addition to the conservation community, we had business, student, faith, shareholder, medical, even motorcycle riders who all joined together with federal and state officials, led by then Interior Secretary Bruce Babbitt, who's pictured here in this New York Times article that was written in 1998 when he came to the swamp, to block the project. And shareholder advocacy was a key component of the campaign. So in 1997 and 1998, shareholder resolutions were filed against the company by faith-based groups. And in 1998, we went up and we did a press conference across the street. And the picture on the upper right is of us having a press conference across the street from the annual shareholder meeting at DuPont headquarters. And the picture at the bottom right is all the petition signatures on petition pages that were taped together that wrapped on the block. That was in the days, in the olden days when petition signatures were on actual paper. And we went inside and we hand delivered 20,000 signatures to the CEO of DuPont, and the shareholder resolution that called on the company to abandon the project received 50 million shares in support, or 3.5% of the outstanding stock. And that was a huge turning point for the campaign and led in great part to the victory. In 1999, DuPont formally abandoned the project, and they then proceeded to work from 1999 to 2003 to try to sell their land and their mineral rights. But to their credit, the federal government said, no, we're not going to buy these mineral rights from you when you shouldn't be doing this mining in the first place. So while they were doing that, I went to law school, and I came out of law school in 2002, and one of my clients was a nonprofit land trust called the Conservation Fund, which is one of the leading land trusts in the United States. And DuPont ended up donating 16,000 acres to the Conservation Fund on the northeastern side of the swamp. And I was the lawyer in that deal, and I handled that acquisition, that donation to the Conservation Fund. And then the Conservation Fund, we put a conservation easement on that acreage, and that prohibited mining by anybody in the future. And we donated the western 7,000 acres of that tract to the federal government for inclusion in the Okefenokee Wildlife Refuge. And that was in 2003. And you can see the article on the front page of the AJC highlighting that. And we thought, we had saved the day from the Okefenokee forever. Turns out we jumped the gun. Fast forward 14 years, and ignoring DuPont's failure, a company called Twin Pines Minerals LLC, a privately held LLC from Alabama that nobody had ever heard of, that turned out to have a terrible track record and was created by former coal miners, bought 7,800 acres off the southeast corner of the wildlife refuge with the goal of trying for DuPont 2.0. And you can see in this figure, the red area right off of the southeastern corner of the refuge is the area that the mining company bought. And that's immediately south of acreage that had been leased to DuPont, the 23,000 acres I mentioned earlier. And keep that in mind, because that'll come back in an important way in a minute. In November of 2020, the mining company applied for permits with the Georgia Environmental Protection Division. That's our state environmental regulator. And what they did was they decided, instead of doing what DuPont did and trying for a 39,000 acre project permit all at once, we're going to do it in little bite-sized chunks to try to probably fool regulators and the public into thinking that our little 580 acre project wasn't so bad. But those of us who were longtime observers knew what they were trying to do was get their camel's nose inside the proverbial tent and ultimately get to the same type of size project. So they proposed this initial, what they called a demonstration phase of the project that was 582 acres in size and involved digging 50 feet down into Trail Ridge. Georgia had the sole jurisdiction over the project under the State Surface Mining Act. And the Surface Mining Act is woefully weak. There's no environmental assessment process similar to the federal process under the National Environmental Policy Act. And there had been no precedent for any project ever being denied a permit. So we were very worried when this happened. And, on top of them threatening to do this project, we come to find out that they have an atrocious track record combined with absolutely no experience in titanium mining. They have been fined by Georgia regulators $20,000 for drilling violations. They've lied about having a lease on their neighbor's property. They cleared acreage without a permit. They were fined $10,000 in Florida for filling in wetlands without a permit. They've never designed or built a titanium mine before, and they're proposing novel extraction technology and proposing to use wastewater evaporation technology that's been tried and failed. In addition, they're affiliated biomass company in Georgia has been fined over $1 million for environmental, air, water, and wildlife violations. And their most notorious event involved killing of 2,100 fish. And over 40 families next door to their plants in Northeast Georgia are suing them for noise and odor nuisance. And just to reiterate, that company, GRP, and Twin Pines are owned and managed by and funded by the same parent company. So what we fear is that it's a preview of coming attractions at the Okie. In 2021 and 2022, the company and regulators went back and forth with finalizing the permit plan. In 2023, a mining plan was released for comment. In 2024, that mining plan was approved by Georgia regulators and a draft permit was issued. And the world reacted very strongly against the plan. Scientists from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Park Service, University of Georgia, and other scores of other independent scientists said that the mining posed an existential threat to the Okefenokee, most notably because it was going to draw down the level of the swamp's water level, which would lead to a tripling of drought frequency. That tripling of drought frequency would in turn increase the risk of landscape level fires that would not only damage sensitive wildlife habitat, but would release carbon dioxide sequestered in the swamp and would destroy commercial timber. And other impacts of concern were salt and chemical pollution into the fragile fresh water of the swamp. Over 150,000 comments were submitted to Georgia regulators over the last 16 months from the general public, over 80 scientists, 120 clergy, the Muskogee and the Muskogee Creek and the Cherokee Nations. Hundreds testified in public hearings against the plan. And over the course of 3 hearings, the only person to testify for the mine was the mining company's lobbyist in the state of Georgia. So when I tell you that nobody wants this mine, I really mean it. Nobody in the world wants this mine except for the mining company. Media leaders and the king of the world have spoken out passionately. The Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal have published numerous stories and op-ed. The publisher of the AJC has published not 1, but 2 front-page editorials urging swamp protection. The most conservative columnist, the most read columnist in Georgia, has adopted this issue and urged Governor Kemp to deny the permits. And then the king of the world himself, Leo DiCaprio, tweeted in April during the comment period on the permits to his 20 million followers saying, "Say no to this mine." In addition, the federal government is saying that the mine would threaten the federal government's water rights in support of the Okefenokee that are integral to the hydrologic integrity of the swamp that was created when the Okefenokee Refuge was created in 1937. And the Supreme Court has recognized the federal government's water rights supremacy. And so it's hoped that if, God forbid, these permits are issued by the state of Georgia, that the federal courts would support the federal government's claim to water. Just a couple other things. The legislature of Georgia has actually spoken out against mining and for protection of the swamp. Over the last 3 years, something called the Okefenokee Protection Act has been introduced that would prohibit mining on Trail Ridge next to the swamp. And it garnered upwards of 100 co-sponsors from both parties. In my 27 years in Georgia, I've never seen a piece of legislation that had such overwhelming bipartisan support to protect an environmentally sensitive place in the state. Never one with so much Republican support, but unfortunately was denied by a vote by House leadership. And the bills have been killed 3 years in a row because we believe of financial campaign contributions and lobbying by the mining company and the adjacent landowner on the governor and the Speaker of the Georgia House. Local governments around the state have spoken out with resolutions. Over 20 cities and counties, including the cities of Savannah and Valdosta, and the counties of DeKalb and Ware. And the goal, again, has been to demonstrate geographic and bipartisan support around the state for the swamp, and to encourage Governor Kemp and Speaker Burns to act for its protection. And my last slide, and then I'll wrap up. Again, the shadow plan is a 35,000 acre project that would include the mining company's property, Toledo Manufacturing, which is the landlord that leased its land to DuPont in the 1990s. That's in this orange, directly north of the Twin Pines property. And then property between Twin Pines and the refuge that's owned by a forest company called Rainier, which is leasing its land for mining elsewhere in Georgia. That total comes to 35,000 acres. And so we're looking at a 35,000 acre project on the hydrologic boundary of one of the most magical places on the planet. With that, I will stop and turn it back over to Gigi.
Great, Josh. Lots of information there to chew on, except as it turns out, Oreos, which is most unfortunate. But clearly, Josh has been in the trenches on this issue for a long time. There's a lot to know about the Okefenokee and what a special place it is, and all of the efforts to protect it over the last 30 years. If you have questions for Josh, we definitely encourage you to put questions into the Q&A so that we can look them over before we get to questions at the end. Our next speaker is Annie Sanders, who is Green Century's Director of Shareholder Advocacy. So she'll concentrate on the shareholder advocacy component of the protection of the Okefenokee and Green Century's role in that.
Great. Thanks, Gigi, and thanks, Josh, for that excellent overview. As Gigi said, I'm Annie Sanders, and I'm the Director of Shareholder Advocacy at Green Century Capital Management. I will talk about our shareholder advocacy work around the threat of mining at the Okefenokee, why we got involved, the risks and opportunities we see for companies, and where we go from here. Next slide. First, just a bit about Green Century. So we were founded over 30 years ago to help people make an impact for the planet with their investments. And a key way that we do that is through our shareholder advocacy program. In addition to applying best-in-class ESG criteria and screens, as well as our unique nonprofit ownership model. Since 1991, we've won hundreds of commitments to corporate policies that protect tropical forests, mitigate climate change, curb plastic pollution, and more. And just in the last proxy season, the 2024 season, we engaged in meaningful dialogue with 54 companies. We filed 42 shareholder proposals, and we won 26 concrete policy changes through constructive dialogue and withdrawal agreements with some of the biggest companies in the world, from Costco to Lowe's to Disney. And we really look at shareholder advocacy as a critical way to leverage our power as investors to push our portfolio companies to do better by the planet. Next slide, please. I want to talk a little bit briefly about what is shareholder advocacy, and then we'll talk about the role that we played in the Okefenokee fight. So first of all, I think most folks probably know this. What is a shareholder? Shareholders own stock in a company, making them owners, and they thus have special access to companies to discuss concerns about risk and company performance. And shareholder rights essentially mean that shareholders have the right to engage companies in different ways, among other things, such as discussions with corporate executives, filing shareholder resolutions, proxy voting, and more. Those can all be really effective ways to drive change towards sustainability for companies and industries. And then one very effective tool is the shareholder proposal, which is a 500-word document that asks the company to take a specific action that shareholders can file with a company, and then through negotiation, withdraw that proposal in exchange for a commitment from the company. Next slide. So shareholder advocates assess the risks that a company faces, and we bring those issues to the attention of management. We lead dialogues with company executives to learn how they're addressing a given issue or a set of risks. And if needed, we'll press for changes through dialogue or by filing a shareholder resolution, or both. And at Green Century, we focus on environmental issues and their associated risks, including from issues like plastic pollution, climate change, deforestation, and more. And we work to help our portfolio companies reduce risk while securing policy changes that improve our air, water, land, and climate. And so in these conversations, some types of risks that we might raise include physical risk from, say, climatic events like wildfires, storms, and floods, reputational risk, so anything that has the potential to damage the public's perception of the business, competitive risk, so potential for actions of a competitor to negatively impact a business, transition risk, regulatory risk. These are some of the risks that we may raise in dialogue with a company or through a shareholder proposal. Okay, next slide. I now want to talk about why we decided to engage companies on protecting the Okefenokee. So in the fall of 2021, Josh's timeline covered a lot of information, but there was definitely going to be a surge of interest in this particular place and issue in 2021, and we became aware of the proposed mine at the Okefenokee. As Josh outlined, it's one of the world's largest freshwater wetlands and one of the biggest natural carbon sinks in North America, where mining would likely destroy wildlife habitat and increase the risk of drought and wildfires. Most people would agree that we shouldn't allow industrial mining in special places like the Okefenokee. There was literally one guy who thought we should, and it was the mining company's lobbyist. Companies that mine titanium and sell us paint for our homes and businesses should source it responsibly and not at the expense of an ecological gem. Most people would agree with that. And then not only do such practices heighten climate and nature risk, but in this particular case, we felt there was also relevant regulatory, legal, and reputational risk from the legislation that Josh mentioned in the Georgia State House, potential lawsuits from nearby landowners, and reputational risk from the widespread public opposition to the mine seen through multiple public comment periods and polling, not to mention the Okefenokee's nomination to be a UNESCO World Heritage Site and extensive media coverage of this issue in high-profile outlets from AP to NBC to New York Times to Leonardo DiCaprio's Twitter following. Did not factor in, but interesting. So given Chemours' exposure to these risks as the world's largest producer of high quality titanium dioxide, we felt that asking Chemours in particular to commit to not mine or sell products containing materials mined at the Okefenokee was a smart business move, given the aforementioned risks and the opportunity then to contribute to a nature positive future where all businesses can thrive without threatening the ecosystem services upon which they and we all depend. So in 2021, we approached Chemours to discuss the issue. We had a few conversations, and after that initial dialogue failed to inspire the company to address these risks, Green Century and the Felician Sisters filed a shareholder proposal asking Chemours to assess the benefits and drawbacks of committing to not engage in titanium mining, nor to purchase titanium mined by others near the Okefenokee. That got the company's attention, which then allowed us to engage in more productive conversations around what it would take for us to withdraw our proposal. And next slide, please. We ultimately won an agreement from the company to avoid mining at the Okefenokee in the near term. So the company stated publicly, and that page is still on their website, that they have no plans to mine, not now or in the near term future, at the Okefenokee, so in the next 5 to 10 years. And that language that they have up is captured here in the screenshot. So that was great. Things go quiet for a year or so. Then, due to the escalating threats that Josh outlined that continue to get coverage in the media, it became clear to us that a near-term commitment was not sufficient to adequately mitigate the potential and growing risks involved in mining at the Okefenokee, and that we needed to bring these issues to other of our portfolio companies that as well might be exposed. So next slide, please. In the fall of 2023, we refiled with the Felician Sisters at Chemours and together also filed new similar proposals at Sherwin-Williams and Home Depot, the largest manufacturer and retailer of paint respectively in the US. Slide, please. This time, we asked for an assessment of the pros and cons of a permanent commitment to protect the Okefenokee because we think it'd be in all three companies' financial interest as sourcing titanium from the edge of the Okefenokee would, we felt, expose them to unnecessary climate, regulatory, legal, and reputational risks. And frankly, it's just hard to see a strong business case for supporting mining at the Okefenokee in any capacity. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, over the winter, each company challenged our proposals at the SEC, arguing that the proposals micromanage the company, And in March, so this is just shown to kind of demonstrate what happened. So Georgia issued draft permits for the mine. And then we got challenged at the SEC, and the SEC agreed, unfortunately, with the companies. They granted each company's request to exclude our proposals from their ballots, meaning that our proposals would not go to a vote before each company's shareholders this year. So this is an unfortunate development, but through these engagements, we were still able to inform the company management of the aforementioned risks. And though none were willing to make a permanent public commitment to not source titanium from the Okefenokee or sell products containing titanium sourced to the Okefenokee, or even put out a report assessing the benefits and drawbacks thereof, which is what we actually asked for in the proposal, we did, through dialogue, get confirmation that after discussing the matter with suppliers and stakeholders, none of the companies currently has intent or future plans to mine at or source from the Okefenokee. This was welcome news, because as the mine gets closer to reality and we continue to face escalating climate and biodiversity crises, disrupting the Okefenokee's unique ecosystem with risky and unnecessary mining would not only be irresponsible, but potentially catastrophic for the planet. So then just last month, as Josh mentioned, the saga continued with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service challenging the state of Georgia on the proposed mine. We will see what comes of that, but regardless, we do plan to follow up on these engagements this year and beyond, because at the end of the day, mining has no place near a biodiversity hotspot like the Okefenokee. And by making a permanent commitment to protect it, we really do believe these companies would not only mitigate serious financial and systemic risks, but also capitalize on a unique opportunity to bolster their environmental image with customers, employees, and with shareholders around the world. So thank you for joining us. I'm going to hand it back to Gigi to introduce our last speaker, Sister Jean.
Great. Thanks, Annie. Green Century's obviously been in the thick of this for a long time, but we don't do it alone. We do it in coordination with many others, including the Felician Sisters of North America. So on that note, I will hand the mic over to Sister Jean Slowinski, who is the Sustainability Coordinator for the Felician Sisters of North America, to talk a little bit about why they chose to get involved in this issue.
Sure. Thank you, Gigi. And thank you, Josh and Annie, and all of you for participating today. I am Sister Jean Slowinski, and I am the Provincial Sustainability Coordinator for the Sisters of North America. I also chair our Social Responsible Investment Committee. And the Felician Sisters are an international congregation. Our North American province extends throughout the U.S. and Canada. Our headquarters is in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania, and I'm currently stationed in Buffalo, New York. You know, as Franciscan women, we actively work among the people in various ministries, but we're highly concerned about the environment and especially the challenges that are faced by climate change. As a province, we've recently adopted a corporate stand on care for creation. We're also members of the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, and that's an organization that's made up of faith groups, investment firms, and pension funds. And we work together to dialogue with corporations on issues of human rights and the environment. We joined the work to protect the refuge in 2021 after hearing about the potential peril that the Okefenokee faced with mining along Trail Ridge. With the assistance of Green Century, we're able to support the work to save the swamp by using our shareholdings to dialogue with Chemours, Sherwin-Williams, and Home Depot, and to raise awareness of the fragility of the swamp, not only to corporate leaders, but then to ask them also to commit to not purchasing anything mined from that area. You know, truthfully, I don't live anywhere near the Okie, and we don't have sisters that are stationed there, but that really doesn't matter. I received a very detailed education on the Okie from local experts, and I learned about the history of the shareholder advocacy and the success with DuPont, and also the dangers that mining posed along the ridge. So it was almost a no-brainer for us to want to join into this work. You know, there's a lot of scientific evidence about the mining dangers along the ridge, with the potential for a substantial ecosystem damage there that's really irreversible. The Okie is not only a fragile ecosystem, but it holds an estimated 120 million tons of carbon, 65% of which sit in the peat beds, as Josh talked about. Water drainage or fires would release that carbon back into the atmosphere, and I tell you, we certainly do not need that. Our purpose as sisters is not necessarily to join in the scientific debate, but we like to open minds to a deeper reality. That is to preserving the area of beauty, that natural resource, a home for various forms of fauna and flora, and to preserve that for future generations. In his encyclical on care for our common home, Pope Francis states that each piece of creation has a purpose and that we have no right to destroy that. So while the Felician Sisters are not located near the Oki, we can use our power as shareholders, give a voice to the Oki itself and all that is contained within it. So we ask companies and we ask local leaders to think deeper and to consider the issue of mining far beyond profits and business. And we ask them to take time to listen to the trees, to the water, to the birds, the reptiles, and all that call the refuge home. To listen to the deeper value of the refuge to the local community, and not just for now, but for the future. To think of the beauty of the refuge now, and then to picture it with dead trees and void of wildlife, because that's what could happen with mining miscalculations. You know, it's about thinking of the results of mining in the long term, not just for short-term business. So I believe that is the role of the sisters to not only provide shareholder support, but to raise awareness that there's much more at stake here, much more than a mining permit. It's about risking the Okefenokee for the future. So with all that being said, the Felician Sisters are committed to stay in the course of this important work. And I hand that back to you, Gigi.
Great. Thank you so much. We have covered a lot of territory in a scant 43 minutes. And so now we can open up the floor for questions. Again, encourage you to pose your questions into the Q&A area, and we will get to as many of those as we can. So the first one, I think I will direct to Annie. Generally, how receptive are companies to environmental concerns raised by shareholders? Is there a threshold of environmental importance or consequence needed to be passed for a company to act?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Emmett, for the question. And I would say it really varies depending on the company and depending on the issue or the risks that we're raising as shareholders. So it's less that we raise a particular environmental issue, but we work to raise risks associated with a particular issue like mining at the Okefenokee. So those risks might be systemic risks like climate risk or biodiversity risk. They might be regulatory risk, could be reputational risk if a company fails to act or otherwise address a series of concerns that are implicated in the issue that we're raising. So I think it depends on how strong the argument is, frankly, on the risk front. So it's again more so the risks that tend to motivate action as opposed to the inherent value in the particular place or environmental issue that we're bringing to the company's attention. Now that's generally the case, and I think there's also value in bringing up not only the risks that the company could mitigate or avoid by taking a particular action, but also the opportunity that the company has to broadly mitigate, say, nature risk, which is a systemic risk and threatens the ecosystem services upon which we all depend. And also there's an opportunity to be seen as a leader on environmental issues, which is a reputational opportunity. So again, I think it depends somewhat on the positioning of the company, the board and management, and also just the industry and the strength of the argument.
Great. Okay, we've got a question over in the chat that came from Max. Thanks, Max, for your question. And the question is, what can the Fish and Wildlife Service do? What's the next possible action? So maybe Josh, you can field that, and then anybody else on the panel can weigh in after Josh.
Sure. Thank you for the question, Max. Yeah, we believe that the Fish and Wildlife Service, does have a legal right to the water that underpins and supports the Okefenokee based on the Federal Reserve Water Rights Doctrine that has been recognized by the U.S. Supreme Court. And we believe that, again, if Georgia EPD were to rule against the science, against the law, against the will of the public, and go ahead and issue these permits, that Fish and Wildlife Service, probably through the U.S. Department of Justice, which is the government's law firm, as it were, would file suit to challenge the issuance of those permits. It would be unclear whether the issuance of the permit would trigger the claim, or whether they would have to wait till excavation were to start at the mine. But in any event, we believe that the federal government would go to federal court to try to block it. The countervailing part of that argument, though, is that unfortunately, even the courts in this country, as everybody on this Zoom has come to understand, even the courts have gotten very politicized. And it really depends upon where such a case would be brought. If a case were to be brought in the Southern District of Georgia, which is where the Okefenokee resides, that is a very conservative and historically anti-environmental court. And we would anticipate that our chances would be a lot weaker than if the case were to be brought in Washington, D.C., in the federal courts up there, which are historically much more favorable to environmental protection. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens. But I'm hoping we never have to get there. I'm hoping that Governor Kemp and the state of Georgia regulators will listen again to the science and the law and the public, and not issue the permits in the first place.
Jean or Annie, anything to add on that?
I do not, no.
Okay.
Josh covered it well. Thank you.
Great. A couple more questions from the Q&A. Joanne, thanks for your question. Can we support this natural area with ecotourism? And then as a second part of that question, how to find a company that will minimize impact, or do you have recommendations?
I can take this too, Gigi. Ecotourism, as I put on my one of my slides, is already a key component of why the Okefenokee is so important to Southeast Georgia. It generates over $90 million annually into the local economy. It supports 700 jobs. But we are hopeful that if the Okefenokee is successful at getting listed on the World Heritage Site list, that will open up a whole new market of international tourists that would come from around the world to visit the Okefenokee by virtue of learning about the Okefenokee, because of the fact that UNESCO is so globally renowned. One thing I should mention is that the mining actually poses a threat to the UNESCO World Heritage Site process. The World Heritage Site process looks at many criteria, but two of them are: one, what are the external threats to the prospective location that wants listing? And secondly, what is the regulatory regime that's in place? Here we have a potential 35,000 acre mining project on the hydrologic boundary of the swamp. UNESCO is not going to be happy with that. And secondly, as I mentioned, Georgia law is woefully weak at protecting places like this. So we are very worried that the UNESCO World Heritage Site process could be sidetracked by this very misguided and very dangerous mining project. And that's one reason why we are urging the governor to deny the permits, so that we don't jeopardize World Heritage Site listing and the boosting of ecotourism for Southeast Georgia, which really desperately needs it.
Great. Let's see. I'm going to go back up earlier into the Q&A a little bit. Question from Aaron. Thanks for your question, Aaron. Are there other companies that have potential exposure to risks associated with mining at the swamp? What can those companies do to avoid the kinds of risks you've raised with Chemours, Sherwin-Williams, and Home Depot?
Yes, great question. Thanks for asking. Yes, there are. Any company that sells products containing titanium, titanium dioxide, again, it's a titanium dioxide, a pigment used in a lot of materials, whether that's paint, sunscreen, military equipment, has a lot of different kinds of uses. Yes, so therefore any company that does sell products containing titanium dioxide has some exposure. The good news is that titanium is the 9th most abundant element on Earth. It's very abundant, and it's the high price of converting titanium ore into usable metals and alloys is the challenging part, but it's actually abundant. So there are plenty of other places to mine titanium, and companies can make a public permanent commitment to not source titanium or titanium dioxide made from titanium at the Okefenokee in any other products. So they can do this exact same thing that we are asking Sherwin-Williams and Home Depot to do. Mining companies can do the same thing we're asking Chemours to do. This commitment is something that can be easily made by any company that has exposure, and plenty of them do. So we would certainly encourage companies to do that. And then, I think that's just to add on to a question earlier. I think Joanne asked how to find a company that will minimize impact. I think the answer to that is companies shouldn't be mining anywhere near the Okefenokee at all. So that's just the position that we hold. It is not worth it in terms of the risks. And in fact, companies have an opportunity to bolster their reputation and their image by committing to not mine or source materials mined from the Okefenokee.
And let me add just one point to Annie's excellent answer on that. We mentioned that, food products, toothpaste, sunscreens all use titanium dioxide based pigment. So companies, food product companies, pharmaceutical companies that make food, that make products like sunscreen are also potential targets of shareholder advocacy. It's not just the paint industry. I would hope that if we have to, that we could, extend our efforts to those other industries too, and send a signal to every potential industry that the Okefenokee should be off limits to your products. And, whether it be paint, there's something that we used to do back in the days where we were fighting to protect, tuna. We would have, safe tuna, dolphin safe tuna. We were trying to protect dolphins that were getting caught in tuna nets. So, the idea of a swamp safe paint or a swamp safe food product is something, that, potentially could be done. There's all sorts of creative ways, I think, to educate consumers about the importance of the swamp and how their choices at the marketplace can, directly help protect this amazing resource.
Okay, great. Let's see. I am going to take the last question, or near last question in the Q&A, because we just have a few minutes left. If we don't get to your question in the Q&A, we can follow up with you afterwards. But a question that's come in from Pat: how might I, as a member of 2 climate organizations in my rural community, educate our population as to how they can use their investments to address their concerns about climate change? We have similar damage and false promises from GE Corporation. Maybe Annie or Jean take first stab at answering that question.
Jean, do you want to go for it?
I guess I don't have that's a difficult answer. I mean, you need to mobilize your local community first, and educate through whatever avenues you have, social media, local gatherings. It's difficult to go against a large corporation. And a lot of the problem also with the Okie is that there's big money involved. There's big money involved in corporate lobbyists. There's big money involved in politicians. in the political world. So you just have to start somewhere, network with other people and organizations that are interested, and just try to build your body from there. Annie?
Yeah, and I'd also say that to the extent that you or others in your community are in fact shareholders of companies that you are interested in talking to about these issues or bringing up these issues to and the risks associated with them, you can do that. As again, going back to the presentation, one of the slides I had earlier, if you're a shareholder, you have certain rights, which entail, advocating to, communicating with the company that you are part owner of. And that is fully within your rights to reach out to the company, reach out to their IR department, investor relations, that the website's usually on there, or the emails rather usually on their website, and you should reach out and lay out your concerns. And I think the more of investors you have joining you to communicate that set of concerns, the stronger your message is. So that's one thing that you can do as a shareholder, or that others who are shareholders of a given company can do to communicate concerns and the risks associated with those particular environmental concerns that you see facing the company.
Okay, great. Thanks to you both. So given that we are at nearly the end of our hour, I'm going to ask each of our panelists what's next. So what's next on this issue? What's next with respect to priorities around protection of this, this most magical place on Earth? So Annie, why don't we start with you, then to Jean, then to Josh.
Great. So as I mentioned, our proposals were rejected by the SEC, and so they were not able to be voted on this year on company ballots. But we will be continuing this conversation and these dialogues with each of the three companies that we filed at, and are certainly considering our next steps in terms of the shareholder advocacy work that we engaged in last year. We may, look at the proposal language and decide to re-engage with a different ask that still gets at the same issues. We are in the planning stages right now, so stay tuned for what's next, but we will certainly be continuing the conversation and perhaps as well expanding the dialogue to include other companies, as one of the questions alluded to earlier. So definitely continue to action on this front next year.
Yeah, and what's next for us is to continue the work, continue to network, continue to talk about it. We are educating about the Okefenokee through all our Felician publications. I'm trying to get others to join in the work. So it's a matter of keeping abreast of what is going on, and hope and praying. We're in the praying business too. So praying that the EPD denies that permit. Josh.
Yeah, thank you, Jean, and thank you, Annie. We have a lot of work to do during this summertime while the Georgia regulators are considering the permits. We are trying to continue to generate as much media attention as possible about the issue, put a lot of pressure on the governor to do the right thing, to follow the law, the science, and the will of the public. We're working on getting other well-known personalities with Georgia ties to follow in Leo DiCaprio's footsteps, to join in the effort to amplify the message, beyond just Georgia. We're working, with the faith community in Georgia. There's an organization called Georgia Interfaith Power and Light, which has been a great partner of ours that has galvanized clergy from around Georgia to write letters to the governor. We actually worked with them to do a prayer vigil at the swamp in December. So they will continue with their efforts. We're also organizing students at the high school and college level at campuses around the state of Georgia because they are very concerned about climate, about resiliency of Georgia's coast to storms. There's a direct correlation between securing carbon hotspots like the Okefenokee and keeping global temperatures down, which will hopefully reduce the impact of storms on Georgia. And then working to amplify any corporate accountability or shareholder advocacy efforts that excellent organizations like Green Century and the Felician Sisters are able to lead. We think that is a fantastic strategy that has been successful in the past with DuPont, as we demonstrated, has been successful with Chemours, and we really want to support that effort going forward as well.
Great. I want to thank all of the panelists for your time today for that excellent session on this issue and on shareholder advocacy more generally. You can subscribe to Green Century's newsletter if you are not already subscribed to get a recording of this session and then also see what's, what happens in terms of what's next. So I appreciate everybody spending your lunch hour with us today, if you're on the East Coast, that is. And thank you very much.
Thanks all.
Thank you, everybody.